Work, Spare Time, and Leisure. An essay by Josef Pieper, the 20th century German Thomist. This essay was first published in 1953. It is now published in Josef Pieper, Only the Lover Sings, Art and Contemplation. Work, Spare Time, and Leisure. These three concepts at first sight do not give any indication that they hide a deeply challenging problem, and no mere theoretical problem either. No, they rather give the impression of being entirely innocuous. They could easily be understood, approvingly or with reservations, as an invitation to take it easy. Our title seems to project an uncomplicated, even cheerful serenity, progressing from one concept to the next. Work, it is true, may still be part of life's burden, but is already alleviated and forgotten as it leads to spare time, and finally, to leisure, with its vision of the solitary fisherman who in utter contentment sits on a summer lake shore, less intent on catching a fish than simply on relaxing and daydreaming. Where, pray, should the problem be lurking? The term and concept of work are entirely familiar to us. Work is that which gives man's work day its name. It satisfies our basic needs and procures our daily bread. It constitutes the active effort to provide those things indispensable in order to stay alive. Nothing is more obvious. And why should the meaning of spare time not be equally obvious? Spare time is a multi-layered concept. As long as it is defined negatively, as a span of time not filled with work, no problem arises. Similarly, if we consider the concept of spare time only in its relationship to the concept of workday, if we define spare time as a mere break from work in order to recover, a time after work to restore one's strength for more work, then again, no particular problem will arise. But some second thought might stir us up as soon as we consider that we do not really succeed in defining spare time only in this way. A moment ago I used in all innocence the term workday. The notion of workday immediately evokes one other notion closely related, which provides a rather fresh and now positive definition of spare time. A definition indicating that here we are discussing something beyond a mere break in working time or a pause to gather new strength. This other notion is holiday. On the one hand, we have not succeeded, rather, not yet, in eliminating the notion of holiday from our thinking, which shows the persistence of Western tradition. On the other hand, this notion of holiday has generally lost for us its clarity, depth, and unquestioned inner meaning, which indicates how weakened and threatened our Western standards have become. A holiday, a feast day, what is this anyway? And what in essence does it mean? How does the spirit of celebration originate in the heart of man? How can it be fostered and preserved? And how can we possibly observe a feast day on a truly existential level without such a spirit of celebration? I very much fear that the typical modern man may no longer be able to draw answers to these questions from immediate awareness and inner experience. Of course, we still have some vague notion that the seventh day of the week is not simply the weekend, but has a deeper significance. We still are receptive to the reminder implied in that uniquely German term, Feierabend, meaning quitting time, but literally evening for celebration. The reminder that more is meant here than a mere break to catch one's breath. And we still have not entirely forgotten that the German word Ferien, vacation time, literally means festive time. All of which taken together means one thing. The concept of spare time is by no means so simple and innocuous as at first it may have appeared. It springs from some profound dimension where it merges, lacking precise bounds, with the third concept, that of leisure. About this concept, we confidently dare to affirm that we do not know what it means. More to the point, we're ignorant of how the concept of leisure is understood in the accumulated wisdom of our Western cultural and existential tradition, as expressed, say, by Plato, Aristotle, or the great teachers of Christianity. Granted, one could say, but why should we know that? What difference does this particular ignorance make? The way we see the human person, and therefore the meaning of our existence, has, after all, changed considerably since the time of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Such an objection must not be taken lightly. At any rate, however, even should we agree with it, and then especially, we have to realize what in truth this discussion is all about. We must understand the total and final disintegration of the concept of leisure, a basic concept of traditional Western thinking, will have a clear historical consequence, namely the totalitarian work state. If we dislike this consequence, we must understand that there can be only one valid objection against the idolizing of labor, an objection based on some ultimate truth about human nature, and therefore of sole and lasting relevance. To identify such an objection, we must discover anew and appropriate again the meaning of the statement, quote, "We work so we can have leisure," end quote. What indeed is declared here? A veritable thicket of misconceptions must be cleared away before the true meaning of the statement can appear. For this purpose, it is indispensable to spell out certain simple basics. It seems the German language is no help in this, since Musse, leisure, and Müßiggang, loafing, distressingly are such close neighbors, though in terminology only. Looking at the factual content, loafing is the exact opposite of engaging in leisure. Leisure, as the ancient Greeks put it, skolin agein. We work so we can have leisure, would therefore, as a preliminary approach, declare this: we work in order to enable us to do something other than work. What is this something other? Recreation, entertainment, amusement, play. All this is not meant here. Wouldn't it be quite nonsensical to think of work as drawing its justification from play? No, this something other indicates an activity meaningful in itself. But is not work equally meaningful? Meaningful indeed, yet not meaningful in itself. This precisely defines the concept of work. It has a practical purpose. It produces utilitarian goods. It contributes to the common useful wealth. And useful always means good for something else. To serve some other purpose is the essential characteristic of work. In this context also belongs the old and rather offensive expression, servile work. The terms alone do not at all imply any contempt for work, much less for the worker. We can say the opposite is true. But then traditional wisdom has always understood that there are also human activities that do not serve some other purpose, and so are not servile. These are forms of activities to which everybody, including the working man, is entitled, even as a fundamental right and necessity. In the same way as the servile activity, namely work, which satisfies basic needs and serves a practical purpose, is as a rule required of everybody. At this point, it seems advisable to mention the old distinction. Some would say the old-fashioned and only historically relevant distinction between servile arts and liberal arts, artes serviles and artes liberales. This distinction, in fact, is anything but old-fashioned. It can claim a contemporary political relevance. Translated into the jargon of a world defined by work alone, it says, Not only do production quotas in the implementation of planning goals exist, but in addition and by right, there are human activities that by their very nature lie beyond the standards of any 5-year plan. This means that there are human actions that need not be justified by a society's yardstick of economical usefulness, and absolutely so. All we have to do is use such terms to bring out the radical challenge to the domain of absolute work. This challenge is contained in the traditional Western tenet. There do exist liberal arts. There do exist human activities that are meaningful without being either work or mere respite from work for more work. This too, I hope, has become clear. It is an insidiously dangerous and consequential undertaking to deny that work is characterized by its usefulness for something else. Yes, even by its servile dimension. It is a fiction to declare work, the production of useful things, to be meaningful in itself. Such fiction leads to the exact opposite of what it seems to accomplish. It brings about the exact opposite of liberation, elevation, or rehabilitation for the worker. It brings about precisely that inhuman dimension so typical of the world of absolute work. It accomplishes the final bondage of man within the process of work. It explicitly makes everybody a proletarian. This is happening openly and explicitly in those totalitarian workers' states, but is also infecting all other parts of the world, at least as a danger and temptation. It shows, for instance, in the difficulty we experience in answering this question. Of what, then, might such activity, meaningful in itself, such liberal activity consist? How should we conceive of such an activity that does not need something other for its justification, that is not defined as producing useful goods and objective results? An activity that does not bring forth the means for our existence, but is existential realization itself. An activity in which man's true and proper good, his genuine richness, fullest life, and most perfect happiness is attained. Obviously, an answer here is possible only if a specific concept of the human person is accepted. For nothing less is at stake here than the ultimate fulfillment of human existence. We are really asking how such fulfillment may come about. Originality, or the lack of it, seems to me quite irrelevant in this regard. I am only trying to express the teaching found in the Western philosophical tradition. The most important element in this teaching declares the ultimate fulfillment, the absolute meaningful activity, the most perfect expression of being alive, the deepest satisfaction and the fullest achievement of human existence must needs happen in an instance of beholding. Namely, in the contemplating awareness of the world's ultimate and intrinsic foundations. Thus would Plato express the sum total of his insights, quote, "Here, if anywhere at all, so spoke the foreign maiden from Montanea. Here man's life becomes fully worth living, for here he beholds the divinely revealed in the purity of beauty itself. Through this he becomes immortal." End quote. A rather small step will bring us back again to the realm of concrete things. The reader may already have wondered, with some misgivings or even dismay, how many more abstruse philosophical subtleties he must endure. Fear not. We have returned to our entirely practical discussion. What constitutes, here and now, an activity meaningful in itself? I have stated it before. If we are unable to answer this question, then we will also be unable to resist convincingly the claims of a world absolutely defined by work. The answer contained in our Western philosophical tradition could be summed up in this way. Whenever in reflective and receptive contemplation we touch, even remotely, the core of all things, the hidden, ultimate reason of the living universe, the divine foundation of all that is, the purest form of all archetypes. And the act of perception, immersed in contemplation, is the most intensive form of grasping and owning. Whenever and wherever we thus behold the very essence of reality, there is an activity that is meaningful in itself taking place. Such reaching out in contemplation to the root and foundation of all that is, to the archetypes of all things, this activity that is meaningful in itself can happen in countless actual forms. A particularly venerable form, particularly neglected as well, is religious meditation. The contemplative immersion of the self into the divine mysteries. Another form is philosophical reflection, which should indeed not be conceived as limited to some specialized academic discipline. Anybody can ponder human deeds and happenings and thus gaze into the unfathomable depths of destiny and history. Anybody can get absorbed in the contemplation of a rose or human face and thus touch the mystery of creation. Everybody, therefore, participates in the quest that has stirred the minds of the great philosophers since the beginning. We see still another form of such activity in the creation of the artist, who does not so much aim at presenting copies of reality as rather making visible and tangible in speech, sound, color, and stone the archetypical essences of all things as he was privileged to perceive them. But those, too, who experience the spark of poetry while listening to a poem, who behold a sculpture and perceive the artist's intention, yes, those who only listen and observe, as long as the conditions are right, can also touch in contemplation the core of all reality, the domain of the eternal archetypes, if the conditions are right. Here lies the difficulty. It is specifically the difficulty already mentioned, to be aware of those different forms of touching the core of reality and to acknowledge them as meaningful in themselves, to experience them and simply to live them as such. Could it be that this difficulty represents the deeper reason for the increasing isolation today surrounding artists and poets, but also philosophers, and certainly those dedicated to the contemplative life? We ought to mention here certain conditions and premises intimately tied, it seems, to the activity that is meaningful in itself. Not much more than a very brief enumeration is possible, though. An activity which is meaningful in itself first cannot be accomplished except with an attitude of receptive openness and attentive silence, which indeed is the exact opposite of the worker's attitude marked by concentrated exertion. One of the fundamental human experiences is the realization that the truly great and uplifting things in life come about perhaps not without our own efforts, but nevertheless not through those efforts. Rather, we will obtain them only if we can accept them as free gifts. With this, we touch on a second precondition, even more fundamental than the first and more removed from any willful manipulation. If this other condition is not fulfilled, we cannot expect to accomplish any action meaningful in itself. Rather, we cannot expect that the meditative perception of the world's foundations will be experienced as meaningful in itself, whether it happens in the form of poetry, music, the fine arts, philosophy, or religious contemplation. This second condition, in a nutshell, is this: the ability to celebrate a feast. What then is required to celebrate a feast? Obviously, more than a day off from work. This requirement includes man's willing acceptance of the ultimate truth, in spite of the world's riddles, even when this truth is beheld through the veil of our own tears. It includes man's awareness of being in harmony with these fundamental realities and surrounded by them. To express such acceptance, such harmony, such unity in non-ordinary ways, this has been called since time immemorial to celebrate a feast. And at this point we realize that there can be no feast without gods. Indeed, that the cultic celebration is the primordial form of any feast. This, however, is a different topic. And yet this much shall be stated here. Only such a fundamental attitude of acceptance can create within the flow of workdays the liberal breathing space that allows us, oblivious of life's more basic necessities, to do what is meaningful in itself. It is for this reason, on the other hand, that all forms of liberal activities, above all in the area of the arts, are essentially of a festive nature, as long as they contain at least some remote echo of that fundamental attitude of acceptance. Wherever this attitude becomes entirely defunct, there all endeavors to organize relaxation surely turn into an even more hectic, indeed an outright desperate form of work. This is not such a far-fetched notion and hardly requires concrete proof. And one further aspect, I think, is not foreign to our personal experience. It is artistic activity, especially, that can degenerate either into idle and empty game playing or into some novel and sophisticated form of busyness, profiteering, and nervous distraction, if it does not simply sink to the level of crass entertainment, apt to seduce man to make himself a prisoner of his workdays with no thought of escaping. Wherever the arts are nourished through the festive contemplation of universal realities and their sustaining reasons, there in truth something like a liberation occurs. The stepping out into the open under an endless sky, not only for the creative artist himself, but for the beholder as well, even the most humble. Such liberation, such foreshadowing of the ultimate and perfect fulfillment is necessary for man, almost more necessary than his daily bread, which is indeed indispensable, and yet insufficient. In this precisely do I see the meaning of that statement in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics: we work so we can have leisure. Work, spare time, and leisure. An essay by Josef Pieper in Only the Lover Sings.